Say your name, the officer snapped, his voice cutting through the evening air like a blade. Because right now, you look like someone who does not belong here. The street had been calm just moments before, a quiet stretch of pavement lined with small shops and dim streetlights flickering to life as the sun dipped below the horizon. But now everything felt different, heavier, like the air itself had stopped moving as people slowed their steps and turned their heads, watching the scene unfold with silent curiosity, some with concern, others with that familiar, distant indifference. And right there in the middle of it all stood Naomi Reed, her posture straight, her expression calm, her hands resting loosely at her sides, as if none of this surprised her, as if she had seen this moment coming long before Officer Ryan Cole ever stepped in front of her and demanded she prove who she was, his stance wide, his hand hovering near his belt, not quite aggressive but far from neutral, his eyes scanning her with a judgment that had nothing to do with facts and everything to do with assumption. And when she finally spoke, her voice was steady, almost quiet. She said, "You already have it." And something about the way she said it made a few people in the growing crowd shift uncomfortably, though the officer only scoffed, taking a step closer, closing the distance as if pressure alone could force the truth he had already decided on. Before continuing, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe because tomorrow's story is one you cannot miss. Ryan let out a short laugh, the kind that carried more dismissal than humor, and shook his head as he circled slightly, tried to assert control over a situation that did not feel as simple as he wanted it to be. "Do not play games with me," he said, louder now, making sure the people around them could hear. "I asked for identification, not attitude," and a few phones lifted into the air, recording, capturing every word, every movement, while Naomi remained still, her eyes meeting his without flinching, without anger, without fear. And that was what unsettled him the most. Not defiance, not resistance, but the complete absence of either, as if she was allowing this to happen, as if this moment was not something being done to her, but something she had already accepted, already calculated, already placed exactly where it needed to be. And for a brief second, barely noticeable, her fingers brushed lightly against the bracelet on her wrist. A small, almost meaningless motion to anyone watching, but her gaze never left his, and the silence between them stretched just long enough to make the crowd lean in, waiting, sensing that whatever was about to happen next was not going to end the way it had begun. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing in a confrontation is not the raised voice or the clenched fist, is the quiet certainty of someone who knows exactly how the story ends before anyone else even realizes they are part of it. Ryan Cole felt the shift before he understood it, like a subtle change in pressure that made the back of his neck tighten as Naomi Reed continued to stand there without moving, without raising her voice, without giving him anything he could push against. And it irritated him more than open defiance ever could, because this was not how these situations were supposed to go. People either argued or they complied. They did not stand still and look at him like they already knew how this would end. And he took another step closer, his boots scraping lightly against the pavement as he reached out his hand, palm open, waiting, expecting, demanding identification. He repeated, slower this time, each word spaced out like he was talking to someone who needed to be reminded of their place. And around them the crowd had grown thicker, a few more phones raised, a few murmurs passing between strangers who had no idea what had started this, but could feel the tension building like a storm about to break. And Naomi finally moved, but not in the way he expected. She did not fumble or hesitate. She did not rush to explain herself. Instead, she calmly reached in her bag, her movements precise, almost deliberate, as if each second was placed exactly where it needed to be. And when she pulled out her wallet, she held it for a brief moment without opening it, her eyes still locked on his. And that same unsettling calm returned, deeper now, heavier, as if the entire scene existed on her terms, even though he was the one with the badge. "You really want to do this here?" she asked quietly, not as a challenge, not as a plea, but as a simple observation, and Ryan let out a short breath through his nose, shaking his head as a faint smirk crossed his face. "What I want," he said, his voice rising just enough for the people filming to catch every word, "is to make sure you are not hiding something." And there was the line that hung in the air heavier than anything else. Because it was not about safety or procedure anymore. It was about assumption, about the unspoken belief that she did not belong. And Naomi seemed to hear it, to recognize it. But instead of reacting, she slowly opened a wallet and slid the card out, holding it between her fingers without handing it over. Just enough for him to see the edge of it, just enough to keep control of the moment. And for a second, Ryan hesitated. Something instinctive telling him that this was not as simple as he wanted it to be. But the presence of the crowd pushed him forward, his authority now something he had to prove, not just to her, but to everyone watching. And he reached out and took the card from her hand, his fingers brushing against hers, expecting resistance, but finding none, and that absence of resistance only made him tighten his grip as he pulled it back toward himself, glancing down with the same casual confidence he had carried into this situation, already certain of what he would find, already building the conclusion in his head before the evidence even had a chance to speak. And Naomi exhaled slowly, almost imperceptibly, her shoulders relaxed, her gaze steady, and once again her fingers brushed lightly against the bracelet on her wrist, a small motion that went unnoticed by everyone except the man standing across the street in a dark suit who shifted his weight ever so slightly, as if acknowledging a signal, while Ryan's eyes scanned the card, the letters forming a name that did not immediately register. Not yet, just shapes and lines under the glow of the streetlight, and he frowned slightly, tilting the card, bringing it closer, reading again, slower this time, and something in his expression changed, not fully, not enough for the crowd to notice, but enough for the first crack to appear in the confidence he had carried into this moment. Because sometimes the truth does not arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it begins as a whisper, a single detail that does not fit, a name that feels heavier than it should. And Naomi watched him in silence, not waiting for permission, not waiting for judgment, but waiting for recognition, because this was the part where everything began to turn. The name lingered in Ryan Cole's mind longer than it should have, like a word he recognized but could not quite place, and he blinked once, then again, his eyes narrowing as he read it a second time under the dull orange glow of the streetlight. Naomi Reed, the letters clean, official, nothing unusual on the surface, and yet something about it felt wrong in a way he could not immediately explain, like a puzzle piece that looked correct but refused to fit, and he shifted his stance slightly, glancing up at her, expecting to see something different now that he had the card in his hand. But she had not changed at all, still calm, still steady, her expression unreadable in a way that made him feel like he was the one being examined, not her. And the murmurs from the crowd continued to ripple outward, low voices speculating, phones still raised, capturing every second as if they sensed that this moment was no longer just another routine stop. And Ryan cleared his throat, trying to reassert control. "Naomi Reed," he said out loud, his tone carrying a forced confidence, as if saying it would make it mean less, would bring it back down to something ordinary. But the name did not shrink under his voice. It stayed exactly where it was, heavy, deliberate. And Naomi tilted her head ever so slightly, watching him, not correcting him, not helping him, just waiting, and that waiting began to feel like pressure, subtle but undeniable, pressing in from all sides. And he looked back, down at the identification, scanning the details more carefully now, his eyes moving slower, catching things he had not paid attention to before, the seal, the formatting, the way the text aligned with a precision that did not belong to a standard license. And his fingers tightened slightly around the card, his thumb brushing over the surface as if he could feel the difference, as if the material itself carried a weight he had not expected. And for a brief moment, something flickered across his face, not fear, not yet, but uncertainty, the first crack widening just enough to let it through. And across the street the man in the dark suit took a single step forward, subtle, controlled, his gaze fixed on Ryan, while Naomi remained exactly where she was, her breathing even, her posture unchanged, her presence anchoring the entire scene as if everything else revolved around her stillness. And Ryan swallowed, barely noticeable, his jaw tightening as he forced a small scoff, shaking his head as if dismissing the thought that had begun to form. "You expect me to believe this," he said, lifting the card slightly, turning it so the crowd could not see, keeping it close, controlled. "You think flashing something like this makes you untouchable?" And Naomi's eyes softened just a fraction, not with sympathy, not with kindness, but with recognition, like she had heard those words before, many times in many places, and she took a slow step forward, closing the distance by just enough to shift the balance. Her voice low but clear. "It is not about what I expect," she said, her gaze never leaving his. "It is about what you already know," and the words landed differently than anything else she had said, not confrontational, not emotional, just precise, and Ryan felt it, the subtle shift from control to doubt, from certainty to something far less stable, and he looked back down at the card one more time, reading the name again, slower now, letting it settle, letting it connect, and this time it did, not fully, not completely, but enough to send a quiet ripple through his thoughts, enough to make him question the version of the situation he had constructed in his head, because names like that did not just appear in places like this, not by accident, not without reason, and the crowd seemed to sense it too. The change in his posture, the hesitation in his voice, the way. The moment stretched longer than it should have, and somewhere in the distance, faint at first but growing clearer, the low hum of an approaching vehicle began to cut through the evening noise, unnoticed by most, but not by Naomi, whose eyes flicked past him for the briefest second before returning, calm as ever as if the next part of this story was already on its way. The low hum grew louder, no longer a distant vibration, but a presence that began to press into the edges of the scene, and Ryan Cole heard it this time, his eyes flicking up instinctively toward the far end of the street where a dark vehicle moved with quiet precision, its headlights steady, not flashing, not urgent, but purposeful in a way that made something tighten in his chest. And for the first time since he had stepped in front of Naomi Reed, his attention broke away from her completely, if only for a second, and that second was enough to shift the balance even further, because when he looked back at her, she had not moved, not an inch, her gaze still on him, calm and unwavering, as if the approaching vehicle was not a surprise but an expected arrival, and the crowd followed his glance, a ripple of curiosity spreading as people turned, whispering, some lowering their phones just enough to see better, while others raised them higher, sensing that whatever was happening was no longer just about a routine stop, and Ryan straightened his shoulders, trying to recover the authority he felt slipping, his grip tightening around the identification card as he stepped slightly to the side, positioning himself between Naomi and the direction of the approaching car. A subtle move, almost instinctive, as if he could block what was coming simply by standing in its path. "Stay right there," he said, his voice firmer now, louder, projecting control even as doubt edged its way into his tone, and Naomi gave the smallest nod, not in submission, but in acknowledgement, like someone confirming a step in a process already set in motion, and that nod unsettled him more than any argument could have, because it felt like agreement on terms he did not fully understand. And the vehicle slowed, its tires rolling quietly over the asphalt before coming to a smooth stop just yards away, the engine idling with a low, steady sound that seemed to quiet everything else around it. Conversations faded, footsteps paused, even the distant city noise felt muted, as if the street itself was holding its breath, and the driver's side door opened first, followed by the rear, and a man stepped out, tall, composed, dressed in a dark suit that caught the faint glow of the streetlights, his posture straight, his movements controlled, not rushed, not hesitant, just deliberate, and his eyes moved quickly across the scene, taking in the crowd, the raised phones, the officer standing rigid with a card in his hand, and finally Naomi, and something in his expression shifted when he saw her, not surprise, not confusion, but confirmation, like he had just arrived exactly where he was supposed to be, and Ryan felt it, that shift, that unspoken recognition passing between them, and it made his jaw tighten as he stepped forward, closing the distance just enough to assert himself again. "This area is restricted right now," he said, his tone sharp, authoritative, though it carried a faint edge that had not been there before. You need to step back. And the man in the suit stopped. Not intimidated. Not confrontational. Simply still, his gaze steady as he looked directly at Ryan. And for a brief moment, neither of them spoke. The silence, stretching just long enough to draw every eye in the crowd tighter into the scene. And then the man spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying a weight that did not need volume to be heard. "Officer," he said, not as a question, not as a challenge, but as a statement of acknowledgement, and Ryan lifted his chin slightly, gripping the card a little tighter. "I am handling a situation," he replied, each word deliberate, as if saying it would make it true, would anchor him back into control. And the man's gaze flicked briefly to the card in Ryan's hand, then back to Naomi. And in that brief exchange, something unspoken passed again, something that Ryan could feel but could not decode. And Naomi finally shifted her weight, just slightly, her voice entering the moment once more, soft but clear. "You asked for my name," she said, her eyes still on Ryan. "So now you should read it carefully." And the words landed heavier this time. Not as a suggestion, not as a warning, but as a line drawn in. A place Ryan had not realized he was crossing, and the street seemed to tighten around that moment, the air thick with anticipation, because the story was no longer building towards something, it was standing right on the edge of it. Ryan Cole felt the weight of every eye on him now. Not just the crowd, but the man in the suit, the silent presence of Naomi Reed, and something deeper, something internal that had begun to shift in a way he could not ignore. And he looked down at the identification card again, this time not with dismissal, but with focus, his eyes tracing each detail more carefully. The name, the formatting, the insignia that he had brushed past before, but now seemed to stand out with a clarity that was impossible to overlook, and his breathing slowed slightly, his grip tightening as his mind began to connect pieces that did not belong together in the way he had first assumed, because this was no ordinary identification, not something easily dismissed, not something someone could simply carry without consequence. And he swallowed, a subtle movement that betrayed the first real crack in his confidence. And Naomi watched him, her expression unchanged, but there was something in her gaze now, not satisfaction, not triumph, but certainty, the kind that came from knowing that the truth did not need to be forced. It only needed to be seen. And Ryan shook his head slightly, as if trying to push back against that realization, his voice rising again, sharper, defensive. "People fake things like this all the time," he said, though the words felt thinner than before, less grounded, like they were meant more for himself than anyone else. And a few murmurs moved through the crowd, uncertain now, no longer fully aligned with his authority, because doubt had a way of spreading quickly once it appeared. And the man in the suit took another step forward, closing the distance just enough to make his presence undeniable, his voice calm but firm as he spoke. "Officer, I suggest you take a closer look." And Ryan's jaw tightened at the tone, not aggressive, not confrontational, but assured in a way that carried its own authority, and he lifted his chin slightly, refusing to step back, refusing to let go of the control he felt slipping through. His fingers, "I know exactly what I'm looking at," he replied, though his eyes betrayed him as they flicked back down to the card once more, lingering this time on the seal, on the text that spelled out more than just a name, on the details that aligned too perfectly, too precisely to be dismissed as coincidence. And his thumb brushed over the surface again, feeling the texture, the weight, the reality of it, and something in his posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, a slight hesitation where there had once been certainty. And Naomi took a slow breath, her voice entering the moment again, steady and quiet. "Then say it," she said, not raising her tone, not pressing, simply placing the truth in front of him like a mirror he could no longer avoid. And the words landed with a weight that silenced even the faintest murmurs around them, because this was no longer about suspicion or control. It was about acknowledgement, about whether he would continue to hold onto a version of reality that no longer fit or finally accept what was right in front of him. And Ryan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the crowd to notice, enough for the man in the suit to remain still, watching, waiting, and enough for Naomi to remain exactly where she was, grounded, unshaken, as if this moment had always belonged to her. And Ryan exhaled slowly, his voice lower now, less certain, as he read the name again under his breath, letting it settle, letting it connect. And this time it did, fully, completely. The realization landing not as a sudden shock, but as a steady, undeniable truth, and his eyes lifted to meet hers, no longer searching, no longer questioning, but recognizing. And in that recognition, everything changed, not with noise, not with force, but with a quiet shift that turned the entire situation on its head. Because the moment he understood who she was the moment he realized he had never been in control at all. The realization did not come with a sound. It came with silence, a heavy, pressing silence that seemed to settle over Officer Ryan Cole like a weight he could not shake. And for the first time since this encounter began, he did not speak, he did not move. He simply stood there holding the identification card as if it had suddenly become something far more dangerous than he had ever anticipated. And Naomi Reed watched him with the same steady calm, her presence unshaken, her posture unchanged, as if this moment was not the peak of tension, but only a step in a process that had already been set in motion. Long before he ever stopped her, and the man in the dark suit shifted slightly closer, his presence now undeniable. No longer just an observer, but an active part of the unfolding reality. And Ryan finally broke the silence, his voice lower, no longer sharp, no longer filled with the same certainty. "This does not change the situation," he said, though even he could hear the strain in his words. The attempt to hold onto control that was slipping through his fingers with every passing second. And Naomi tilted her head just slightly, her eyes never leaving his. "It changes everything," she replied, her voice calm but firm, and there was no argument in it, no need for one, because the truth did not require force, it only required acknowledgement. And the crowd felt it, the shift in tone, the change in energy, the way the officer who had once stood so firmly in control now seemed to be recalibrating, searching for footing in a situation that no longer followed the script he had expected. And Ryan took a small step back, barely noticeable, but enough to create distance, enough to signal that something had changed. And he looked at the card again, this time not with doubt, but with understanding, the kind that settled slowly but completely. And he cleared his throat, trying to regain some sense of authority. "If you have something to say, then say it," he added, though the challenge in his voice had softened into something closer to uncertainty. And Naomi exhaled slowly, her gaze steady, her tone measured as she spoke. "You stopped me because you believed I did not belong here," she said, each word deliberate, each one landing with quiet precision. "You asked for proof, and now you have it. But the question is not who I am." She paused, just long enough for the silence to deepen, for the weight of her words to settle into the space between them. "The question is why you needed it in the first place." And the statement did not accuse, it revealed, it held up a mirror not just to him, but to the entire moment, to the assumptions that had brought them here. And Ryan felt it, not as a sudden shock, but as a slow, uncomfortable awareness that crept in despite his efforts to push it away, and he glanced briefly at the crowd, at the phone still recording, at the faces now watching him with a different kind of attention, no longer passive, no longer indifferent, but engaged, questioning, and the man in the suit stepped forward again, his voice calm, but carrying a weight that could not be ignored. "Officer Cole," he said, addressing him directly now, and the use of his name landed like a quiet confirmation of everything Ryan had just realized. "I think it would be best if you to escalate this situation." And Ryan's jaw tightened at the phrasing, at the implication, at the fact that control was no longer his alone to define, and he took a breath, slow, measured, as if trying to steady himself, trying to find a way to navigate a moment that had shifted beyond his expectations. And Naomi remained still, her presence anchoring the entire scene, her silence now more powerful than any words could have been. Because the confrontation was no longer about force or authority, it was about truth, and truth had a way of changing everything once it was seen. The silence that followed did not feel empty. It felt loaded, like something invisible had settled into the space between every person on that street. And Ryan Cole could feel it pressing against him from all sides, from the crowd, from the man in the suit, and most of all from Naomi Reed, who had not raised her voice once yet now seemed to control the entire moment without effort, and he shifted his weight slightly. The movement subtle but revealing, because it was no longer the stance of someone in command. It was the stance of someone recalculating, someone searching for solid ground where none seemed to exist. And he looked down at the identification card again, not because he needed to read it, but because he needed something to anchor himself to, something familiar, something procedural, but even that felt different now, heavier, and his grip loosened just a fraction before tightening again, as if he could still hold onto the authority it represented. And Naomi watched him, her gaze steady, not pressing, not rushing, just present. And that presence forced the moment to stretch, forced him to sit inside it longer than he wanted to, longer than he was used to, and he exhaled slowly, a controlled breath that did little to steady the unease building in his chest. And for a brief second his eyes flicked toward the man in the suit, who remained still, composed, observing with a quiet certainty that made it clear he was not here to escalate, but to witness, to confirm, and that realization unsettled Ryan more than any confrontation could have, because it meant this moment was not just happening. It was being seen, being recorded, being understood beyond his control, and the faint sound of someone shifting in the crowd broke the stillness, followed by a whisper, then another, the ripple of awareness spreading outward as people began to sense that the story they were watching had changed direction, that the officer who had started this encounter was no longer the one defining it. And Ryan cleared his throat again, his voice lower now, less sharp. "I was doing my job," he said, the words coming out slower, more deliberate, as if he needed them to sound true, to feel true. And Naomi nodded once, a small, measured gesture that did not challenge him but did not agree either, and she took a step forward, closing the distance just enough to shift the balance again, her voice calm, steady. "Then do it properly," she said, and the simplicity of the statement cut deeper than any accusation could have, because it did not argue, it did not attack, it simply redefined the standard he had failed to meet, and Ryan felt it land, felt the weight of it settle into the space where his certainty used to be, and he opened his mouth as if to respond. But no words came, not immediately, because there was no quick answer to something that had already been exposed, and the man in the suit stepped closer now, no longer holding back, his presence aligning with Naomi in a way that made the hierarchy of the moment unmistakably clear, and he extended his hand slightly, not forceful, not aggressive, but firm in its intention. "Officer Cole," he said again, his tone unchanged, the identification, and Ryan hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for the crowd to notice, enough for the shift to become undeniable. And then slowly, almost reluctantly, he extended his hand and returned the card, his fingers releasing it as if letting go of something more than just a piece of plastic, and Naomi accepted it without breaking eye contact, her movements smooth, controlled, and as she placed it back in her wallet, the tension in the air did not disappear, transform, because this was no longer a confrontation. It was a transition, a moment where control had quietly, completely shifted, and Ryan straightened slightly, tried to regain some semblance of authority, but the effort felt hollow now, like a performance that had already been seen through, and Naomi spoke. Once more, her voice soft but carrying across the space with clarity. "You asked for my name," she said. And for a brief moment she paused, letting the words settle, letting the silence hold them in place. "Now you understand it." And Ryan met her gaze, and for the first time, there was no resistance in his expression, no dismissal, only the recognition of a truth he could no longer deny. And in that recognition, the moment shifted again, deeper this time, moving beyond confrontation into something far more permanent, because once a person sees clearly, they cannot go back to seeing the same way again. The moment did not end when the card left his hand. It evolved, shifting into something quieter, yet far more revealing. And Ryan Cole felt it in the way the street no longer responded to him the same way. The way the crowd no longer looked at him as the center of authority, but as part of a scene that had already moved past him. And he stood there, shoulders squared but no longer grounded. As Naomi Reed slipped the identification back into her wallet with a calm precision that carried more weight than any raised voice ever could. And the man in the suit stepped fully into place beside her now. Not behind, not observing, but aligned, his presence reinforcing what had already begun to unfold, and Ryan's eyes moved between them, searching for something to hold on to, something to reframe the moment. But every detail only confirmed what he was beginning to understand, and the faint hum of the vehicle behind them continued, steady and low, like a reminder that this situation was no longer contained within his control. And Naomi adjusted her sleeve slightly, the bracelet on her wrist catching the light for just a second, a small detail that seemed insignificant yet somehow intentional, and Ryan noticed it this time. Not because of the object itself, but because of the pattern, the way she moved, the way everything about her felt deliberate, measured, as if every second of this encounter had been anticipated long before it began, and he felt a flicker of something unfamiliar. Not fear exactly, but the awareness of being outmatched in a way that had nothing to do with strength or volume. And the crowd shifted again, closer now, drawn in not by chaos, but by clarity, by the quiet unraveling of a situation that no longer needed escalation to hold their attention. And one voice from the edge of the group spoke just loud enough to be heard. "What is going on?" And another answered softly, "I think you picked the wrong person." And those words moved through the air like a current, subtle but undeniable. And Ryan heard them, even if he pretended not to, and his jaw tightened slightly as he forced himself to stand taller, to regain composure. But the effort felt different now, heavier, like something he was holding together rather than something he naturally carried. And the man in the suit finally spoke again, his voice calm, controlled, but unmistakably authoritative. "This interaction has been documented in full," he said, not as a threat, not as a warning, but as a statement of fact. And Ryan's eyes flicked toward the phones in the crowd, then back to the man, then to Naomi, and the realization deepened. Because this was not just about a single moment, it was about accountability, about visibility, about a system that was no longer hidden behind routine. And Naomi took a small step forward, not closing the space completely, but enough to anchor the moment once more, her voice steady. "You believed you had the right to question me," she said, and there was no anger in it, only clarity. "But what you did not consider is who is allowed to question you." And the words landed with a quiet finality that seemed to settle over everything. And Ryan felt it, the shift from reaction to consequence, from control to reflection. And for the first time since this began, he did not immediately respond, because there was nothing left to push against, nothing left to challenge. Only the truth standing in front of him, undeniable, and the man in the suit reached into his jacket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a small device, holding it at his side without raising it, without making a show of it. And Ryan recognized it immediately, not the object itself, but what it represented, authority of a different kind. One that did not need to be asserted loudly to be understood. And Naomi's gaze remained steady, her presence unchanged, but the energy around her had shifted completely, no longer defensive, no longer reactive, but resolute, as if this moment was not just about what had happened, but about what would happen next. And the street, once filled with casual movement and passing noise, now felt like a stage where every detail mattered. Every word carried weight, and every silence spoke louder than anything else, because the story was no longer building toward question. It was revealing an answer that had been there all along. For a brief moment, it almost felt like everything might settle, like the tension that had stretched across the street would slowly dissolve into nothing more than an uncomfortable misunderstanding. And Ryan Cole leaned into that feeling, clinging to it, because it was familiar, because it offered him a way out that did not require him to fully confront what had just unfolded. And he straightened his uniform slightly, rolling his shoulders back as if resetting himself, his voice returning with a measured tone that attempted to reclaim structure. "All right," he said, nodding once as if concluding the situation. "We are done here." And the words hung in the air with a forced finality, like a door being closed too quickly, and a few people in the crowd shifted, uncertain, some lowering their phones as if the moment had passed, while others hesitated, sensing that something about the ending did not match what they had just witnessed. And Naomi Reed did not move. She did not step away. She did not accept the conclusion he was trying to impose. She simply stood there, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged, and that stillness disrupted the illusion of closure almost immediately, because it made it clear that the story had not reached its end. Not yet. And Ryan felt it, the resistance not in words but in silence. And he glanced briefly at the man in the suit, expecting some form of agreement, some acknowledgement that the situation could be contained and moved on from. But the man did not nod. He did not step back. He did not signal any form of acceptance. Instead, he remained exactly where he was, composed, watching, and that lack of response carried more weight than any objection could have, and Ryan's jaw tightened slightly as he looked back at Naomi, his voice firmer now, edged with a trace of impatience. "You are free to go," he added, as if granting permission, as if that permission still held meaning. And Naomi finally moved, but not away. She stepped forward just enough to close the distance again, her voice calm. "Even I was always free," she said, and the simplicity of the statement cut through the space more sharply than any raised voice could have, because it exposed a flaw in his assumption, the idea that her freedom had ever been his to give, and the crowd reacted to that, a quiet ripple moving through them, a few murmurs, a few exchanged looks. As the weight of her words settled into the moment, and Ryan felt the shift again, felt the control he was trying to reassert slipping further out of reach, and he exhaled slowly, his patience thinning as he searched for a way to end this on his terms. "Then leave," he said, the edge in his voice sharper now, not aggressive but strained, and Naomi held his gaze unshaken. "Not yet," she replied, and those two words landed with a finality that stopped everything once more because they did not challenge him. They did not argue. They simply refused to comply with the version of reality he was trying to impose, and the man in the suit stepped forward fully now, his presence aligning unmistakably with hers, his voice calm, but carrying an authority that no longer needed to be introduced. "Officer Cole," he said, and this time there was no room for interpretation in his tone. "This interaction is not concluded," and Ryan felt it then, not as a sudden realization, but as a slow, unavoidable truth, that what he had thought was an ending was only a pause, a false closure that could not hold under the weight of what had already been set in motion. And his eyes moved between them again, the pieces aligning in a way that left no space for denial, and the crowd leaned in, the silence tightening, anticipation building once more, because the story they were watching had not ended. It had only shifted, and whatever came next was not going to be defined by him. Not anymore. The words settled like a final warning that could no longer be ignored, and Ryan Cole felt something shift deep inside him. Not just uncertainty now, but the clear realization that this moment had moved beyond his authority entirely. And he stood there for a second longer than he should have, his mind racing through options that no longer seemed to exist, because every path that once felt available had quietly closed without him noticing. And the man in the suit took one deliberate step forward, his posture straight, his presence calm, but absolute. And when he spoke again, his voice carried a clarity that cut through the tension with quiet precision. "For the record," he said, his gaze fixed on Ryan, "this interaction is now under formal review." And the words did not come with raised volume or visible force, but they landed heavier than anything else that had been said so far, because they did not describe what had happened. They defined what would happen next, and Ryan's grip tightened briefly at his side, his jaw setting as he tried to hold on to something, anything, that still felt like control, but the ground beneath him had already shifted too far, and Naomi Reed stood just beside the man now, her presence aligned with his in a way that made their roles unmistakable, and she finally spoke again, her voice calm, steady, but carrying a weight that no longer needed explanation. "You asked for my name," she said, and this time there was no pause, no hesitation, only a direct line of truth. "Naomi Reed, Director of Federal Oversight," and the title did not echo loudly. It did not need to, because the meaning behind it moved through the crowd like a quiet shock, subtle at first, then undeniable as whispers began to spread. Phones lifted higher, and the entire energy of the street shifted once more, not toward tension now, but toward realization. And Ryan felt it hit him fully, not as a gradual understanding this time, but as a clear, undeniable fact that left no room for interpretation. And his eyes met hers again, but this time there was no challenge left in them, no attempt to assert dominance. Only the recognition of what he had stepped into without knowing. And the man in the suit reached into his jacket and withdrew a badge, holding it up just enough for Ryan to see. His voice measured as he spoke. "We have been monitoring conduct in this district for some time, and each word landed with deliberate weight, building a structure that Ryan could not step outside of. Tonight was not random." And that sentence changed everything, because it reframed the entire encounter, turning what had felt like a spontaneous situation into something far more intentional, far more controlled. And Ryan's breath slowed, his posture stiffening as the full implication settled in. That every word, every action, every assumption he had made had been seen, recorded, and now carried consequences that extended far beyond this street. And Naomi's gaze remained steady, not cold, not harsh, but unwavering. And she took a small step forward, closing the final distance, her voice soft but carrying. Across the silence, "You did not just stop a woman," she said. "You revealed how you choose who belongs." And the statement did not accuse, it defined, it placed his actions into a context he could no longer deny. And the crowd stood completely still now, no longer whispering, no longer shifting, because the moment had moved beyond curiosity into something deeper, something that demanded attention, and Ryan felt it. The weight of being seen, truly seen, not just by the people around him, but by something larger, something that extended beyond this single moment. And he lowered his gaze for a brief second, the first visible sign that the authority he had relied on was no longer enough to shield him from what was unfolding. And when he looked up again, the story had already changed, not with force, not with confrontation, but with the quiet, undeniable power of truth finally being named. Ryan Cole did not realize he had stopped breathing until the silence forced him to notice it, a tight pressure in his chest that had nothing to do with the air and everything to do with the moment closing in around him. And for the first time since this began, he did not look like a man holding authority. He looked like a man standing inside the consequences of his own actions, and the weight of Naomi Reed's words settled deeper with each. Passing second, not loud, not dramatic, but undeniable. And the man in the suit stepped forward once more, this time with no distance left between them. His presence now fully established, his voice calm but final. "Officer Ryan Cole," he said, speaking his full name with deliberate clarity, "you are being formally placed under administrative review effective immediately." And the sentence landed with a precision that removed any remaining illusion of control. And Ryan's eyes flicked up, meeting his, searching for something to push back against, some angle to reclaim ground. But there was none, only structure, only procedure, only the steady unfolding of accountability that could not be interrupted by force or denial. And the man continued, his tone unchanged. "You are to stand down from active duty pending further investigation." And those words carried a finality that echoed through the street, through the crowd, through Ryan himself. And for a brief moment, no one moved, not the onlookers, not the man in the suit, not even Naomi, because the shift had already happened, and everything that followed was simply the confirmation of it. And Ryan's shoulders lowered just slightly, the smallest visible sign of something breaking beneath the surface. And his hand, which had hovered near his belt earlier with unconscious confidence, now hung at his side without purpose, without certainty, and Naomi watched him, not with satisfaction, not with anger, but with a quiet steadiness that reflected something deeper than the moment itself, something rooted in principle rather than reaction. And she took a slow breath before speaking again, her voice soft but carrying across the silence. "This was never about the identification," she said, her gaze unwavering. "It was about what you believed before you even asked, and the words did not accuse, they clarified. They drew a line between action and intention that could not be erased, and Ryan felt it, not as a sharp impact, but as a steady unraveling, the realization that this was not just about what he had done in the last few minutes, but about a pattern, a perspective, something that had existed long before this street, long before this encounter, and now stood exposed in a way he could not step away from, and the crowd remained still, the earlier whispers replaced by a heavy quiet. Because what they were witnessing was no longer just a confrontation. It was a shift in power, a reversal that did not rely on volume or force, but on truth, and the man in the suit reached out slightly, not aggressively, not physically imposing, but with a clear expectation, and Ryan understood without needing it to be explained. His fingers moved slowly, deliberately, unclipping the small device from his shoulder, his radio, his connection to the authority he had carried into this moment. And as he held it in his hand for a brief second, there was a pause, a hesitation that spoke louder than any words could have, before he extended it forward, placing it into the man's waiting hand, and that simple motion marked the end of something, not just the encounter, but the version of control he had relied on, and Naomi's gaze remained steady as she watched, her presence unchanged, but the meaning of it now fully revealed, and Ryan lifted his eyes once more, meeting hers. And for the first time, there was no resistance left, no attempt to dominate, only the quiet recognition of a truth he could no longer deny. And in that recognition, the story reached its turning point, not with chaos, not with force, but with the quiet, undeniable shift of justice taking its place. The moment did not explode. It settled, heavy and undeniable, like a truth that had finally found its place. And Ryan Cole stood there without reaching for anything, without speaking, without trying to reclaim what had already slipped beyond him. And the absence of his voice said more than any argument could have, because the authority he had carried into this street had already been replaced by something quieter and far more permanent. And the man in the suit held the radio in his hand for a brief second before passing it to another arriving official who had stepped out of the vehicle, their movements smooth, coordinated, practiced, and without urgency, because there was no need for force when the outcome had already been decided, and Naomi Reed remained where she was, her posture relaxed but grounded, her presence no longer reactive but resolute, as if this moment was not a victory but a correction, something that had needed to happen and now simply was, and the crowd watched in. Complete silence, the earlier whispers gone, replaced by a stillness that carried understanding, because what they had witnessed was not chaos or conflict, but clarity, the kind that changes how a story is remembered. And Ryan finally moved, a small shift of his shoulders, a slow breath leaving his chest as he looked around. Not at Naomi, not at the officials, but at the people, the faces that had recorded everything, the eyes that had seen him not as a symbol of protection, but as a reflection of something deeper, something flawed. And that realization did not strike him like a blow. It settled into him like weight, something he would carry long after this street returned to normal. And Naomi took a step forward, not to close distance, but to complete the moment, her voice calm, measured, and clear. "This is how it changes," she said. And the words were not directed at him alone. They moved through the space, through the crowd, through the silence itself. Not with noise, not with force, but with truth that cannot be ignored. And the simplicity of her statement gave it power, because it did not demand attention. It held it. And the officials around Ryan began to guide him gently, not with aggression, not with humiliation, but with procedure, with a structure that mirrored the very system he had believed he controlled. And he did not resist, he did not argue, because there was nothing left to push against. And as he took a few slow steps, the distance between him and Naomi grew, but the meaning of what had happened remained fixed, unchanging. And the man in the suit turned slightly toward Naomi, offering a small nod, not of approval, but of acknowledgement, as if confirming that the moment had reached its intended point. And Naomi returned the nod, just as subtly, her gaze steady, her expression composed, because this was never about proving power, it was about revealing it, and the vehicle behind them remained idling, its quiet presence now less imposing and more symbolic. A reminder that accountability does not arrive loudly. It arrives when it is needed, and the crowd began to shift slowly. People lowering their phones, stepping back, but no one left quickly because they understood in their own way that they had just witnessed something that would stay with them, something that would change how they saw moments like this in the future. And Naomi finally turned, her steps calm, measured, as she moved away from the center of the street, not looking back, not needing to, because the story no longer required her presence to continue. It had already been written into the memory of everyone who had seen it. And as the night air settled once more, and the street began to breathe again, one truth remained, quiet but unshakable. That power is not proven by who you can question, but by how you answer when the truth stands in front of you. The street did not return to what it had been, not right away, because moments like that do not simply fade. They settle into the space, into the people, into the memory of what was seen and what was finally understood. And as the officials guided Ryan Cole toward the waiting vehicle, there was no resistance in him, no sudden outburst, no attempt to rewrite what had already unfolded. Only a quiet acceptance that moved with each step he took, slow and measured, as if he was carrying the full weight of the realization with him. And the crowd parted just enough to let him pass, not with hostility, not with celebration, but with a silence that spoke louder than either, because they had seen enough to understand that this was not about a single moment. It was about something larger that had been revealed in real time. And Ryan kept his eyes forward, his posture no longer rigid with authority, but held together by something more fragile, something reflective. And as he reached the vehicle, one of the officials opened the door, not forcefully, not hurriedly, just as part of a process that had already been set in motion, and he paused for a fraction of a second before stepping inside, a small hesitation that marked the final break between who he believed he was at the beginning of this night and who he had become by the end of it, and the door closed with a quiet sound that seemed to echo more than it should have, sealing not just the vehicle, but the outcome of everything that had led to this point. And Naomi Reed stood where she was for a moment longer, her gaze following the scene not with judgment, but with a calm understanding, because this was never about watching someone fall. It was about ensuring that something broken was finally seen clearly. And the man in the suit approached her once more, his expression composed, his voice low as he spoke. "It is done." And Naomi gave a small nod, not as a sign of satisfaction, but as acknowledgement, because what had happened was not an end. It was a continuation, a step in a process that did not rely on moments like this alone, but was built on them. And she turned slightly, her eyes moving across the crowd, taking in the faces, the quiet attention, the awareness that lingered even as people began to slowly step back, lowering their phones, speaking in softer tones, because they understood that they had witnessed something that would stay with them long after the street emptied. And Naomi took a breath, the cool night air steady and grounding, before she began to walk, her steps unhurried, her posture unchanged, moving away from the center of the moment with the same calm presence she had carried into it. And as she passed by a few people, their eyes followed her not with curiosity now, but with recognition, because her name was no longer just a detail on a card. It had become a moment, a turning point, something that carried meaning beyond itself. And the vehicle pulled away slowly, its movement smooth and controlled as it disappeared down the street, taking with it the last visible piece of what had happened, but not the impact, because that remained woven into the space, into the people, into the quiet understanding that had replaced uncertainty. And the streetlights above continued to glow, casting a steady light over everything as if nothing had changed. But everything had, and Naomi did not look back because she did not need to. The story had already closed itself, not with noise, not with force, but with clarity. And as her figure moved further down the sidewalk, blending into the rhythm of the city once more, one truth remained, steady and undeniable, that he thought a name was something to question, but that night, a name became something that answered him, because he believed he was the law. But that day, the law had a different face.